Hi, Bighara here with another installment of my video blog. Today I was going to talk a little bit about the dice and the dice mechanics of various systems. Specifically, I was going to talk a little bit about systems that use a bell curve of dice as opposed to a linear curve or a lack of curve when rolling the dice. Uh, I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a big math nerd or anything like that. So I'm not going to be able to explain all the number crunching and everything, but I can give it to you in simple terms and then talk a little bit about why I was going to discuss it and how it pertains to gaming. Basically, when you're rolling a 20-sided die, like if you're making an attack roll in Dungeons and Dragons or a Dungeons and Dragons type game, you are rolling linear probability, which basically means every number has an equal chance of coming up. So, if you were going to graph it, it would look something like this graph here, which I found on the internet. It's not much of a curve. Whereas if you're rolling something like 3d6 and then adding them up, you're going to get a middle ground, which is going to be a range of numbers that are more likely to come up than the extreme numbers at either end. And the curve would look something like this graphic, which I found on the internet. The idea being things like a 10 or 11 are going to be more common than a 3 or an 18. And this is how also games like craps are built around, because the idea there are certain numbers like 7 with 2d6, which there are many ways for that to come up. You can roll a 6 and a 1, a 3 and a 4, a 5 and a 2. Whereas something like Snake Eyes, there's only one way to roll that. So the odds are different. Some people who are proponents of games which use multiple dice, not percentile, because percentile you're not adding them. So that's there's no curve to that. It's every combination of numbers, whether it's an 01 or a 00 or a 50 or a 22 or whatever, has an equal chance of coming up. But if you're rolling, and GURPS is a good example of this, where you would roll 3d6 and then add them and then add skills. The idea being, some people believe that's a more realistic system. The idea being an average result is more likely than a horrible result or a terrific result. Whereas if you're rolling a 20-sided die, you're just as likely to get a critical as a fumble or anywhere in between. So you have people who kind of denigrate the older systems that use that linear progression. I know I've had many conversations with various people about this, some of them in my group, some of them online. And I'm not arguing the math, because first of all, I'm not qualified to argue the math, and second of all, I do understand it enough for what they're saying, but I don't think that's the point. When you're rolling something like an attack roll, and you're rolling a 20-sided die, like in Dungeons and Dragons or games like that, in a lot of the books will say this very explicitly. This is not representing just one swing of your sword or shot of your, one just you loosing the arrow. This represents a certain amount of abstraction, maneuvering for the shot or the hit or whatever you're doing, and then the die roll is just kind of representing the ultimate result of your attempts to attack that combat round. And it takes into account, in a very abstract way, sort of a fog of war. This can be things like the give and take in maneuvering for position, things getting in your way, bad footing. All sorts of ideas could be, included within that idea. And in those situations, if you're in an actual fight, standing with toe to toe with an orc or another bandit or whatever it is, and swinging swords or what have you, really anything could happen in those situations. I mean, I think reasonably speaking, you might be a master swordsman, but you could slip in the mud, you could drop your sword, you could do all sorts of things. That little scrawny goblin has a rusty dagger might get in a lucky shot. Those things are all possible. This is why we have to roll the dice and see what happens. We can't just say, well, your character has this much experience and your opponent only has that much experience, therefore you automatically win. Not only is that, well, dull, but that's not realistic. So, in a situation like combat, I think people have to understand that yes, you might roll a d20 and you might get a 1. And oh, but I'm really good with the sword. The chances of me rolling that 1 was only a 5% chance of that happening. But the chance was there, and it'll come up. And I think worrying about a bell curve or things for those sorts of situations, I don't see it as necessary. I don't see it as a big deal. It won't keep me from playing a game that uses something like a 3d6 pool if that's what somebody wants to run, and we're working from a bell curve. Okay, I understand. That's fine. I'll roll with that. No pun intended. But I don't see it as making the combat particularly unrealistic, at least just because of the die roll or what die you're rolling. Um, there are a couple balancing factors for that. The obvious one is as you go up in level and you get better at what you're doing, the range of numbers, which will indicate a success for you, goes up as well. So your THACO, your threat to hit armor class 0 in the case of D&D, that goes down. So you need to roll a lower and lower number to get a success against a given armor class of opponent. So you're getting better at things. I think that's you'll succeed more overall. It's not maybe not the individual die roll, but in an overall course of a total fight of several rounds or from fight to fight to fight, you're going to hit more and more often as you get better. That's just the law of averages. Also, there's hit points. And hit points, as most people in old school D&D and stuff, and later editions too, I assume, will say, in D&D at least, hit points are not literally physical injury necessarily. They're more abstract. They can be you got cut, you got bruised, you got whatever, but they can also be fatigue, rolling with punches, luck. There's all sorts of things that explain why that 10th level fighter might have 70 hit points, where when he was first level he only had 4. Um, that's not just he suddenly became almost 20 times tougher. He got more experience. It's not that his skin is harder or bones are tougher or anything like that. So you have to take those things into account, and I think those help balance that situation. The reason where a bell curve I think would become more important is when you're rolling for lots of things, not just in combat or a few very dramatic or risky or whatever situations. And then it makes more sense that the idea that if you're doing something that's more mundane or more just average, that you should succeed on average. Personally, from an old school gaming perspective, that would make me think maybe you're rolling too much. And by that I mean not everything needs a die roll. I mean, if you're playing things out and you're using your role playing and you're describing things and the DM's describing things back to you, some things I don't know that would necessarily require a die roll. Unless it's something where there's a significant consequence to failure, or you're in some sort of a crisis mode where you're really under the gun, a lot of times I think you don't have to worry about rolling to see if it happens, as long as a person has some reasonable chance of success under normal circumstances. A character sitting at his favorite tavern after an adventure having a beer. Are you going to make him make a saving throw or a constitution roll to see if he becomes intoxicated and falls over drunk and unconscious from one drink? Yeah, even if he has a lousy constitution, I mean, I don't think that that's necessary. Character's walking across the road, there's a mud puddle, he wants to jump over it instead of getting his boots muddy. You gonna make him make a dexterity check for that? I mean, what? I mean, unless it's somehow really crucial or important, like there's some real consequence to failure. I mean, is he trying to jump over a puddle of burning oil during a sword fight? Okay, yeah, maybe there you're going to have to make some sort of die roll. Are you in a drinking contest against an ogre, and to see who gets to who eats who, or who lives or who dies or something like that? Okay, at that point some sort of saving throw or constitution roll might be in order, because again you're in a sort of more of a crisis situation. You're in a situation where that success or failure has real consequences for you. So in those cases, yeah, maybe a die roll. But in a lot of the little stuff, even in a dungeon situation, do you make a person roll to light a torch? Come on, there's a if unless there's some sort of really extraordinary situation going on, no, you're not going to make them roll. You say, oh, your torch burned out. I'll light another. Okay, you light another. It's in the middle of a fight and it's the only light source. You might say, okay, you're trying not to get your head caved in by that bugbear while you're lighting a torch. Let's see you make a dexterity roll or something to avoid dropping the torch or what have you. But that's, again, now that's a crisis situation. Another good example in D&D where you're rolling and it's a linear as opposed to a bell curve are the thief skills. And I do feel that those are a little bit different because generally when a thief is rolling on most of those skills, there's a consequence for failure. Even if it's not a combat situation. You know, if you don't pick the lock, the door doesn't open. If you fail a pickpocket attempt, maybe that 18th level wizard that you were attempting to rob suddenly noticed your hand at his belt pouch, and he might have something to say in the form of a fireball or something like that. That's a consequence, and it's a I don't want to say it's a crisis situation, but it's not just purely academic. You don't have all day. You're not just fiddling around. You know, if the thief there was a lock the thief had picked 100 times before, and he was there in an abandoned building, and he could spend all day at it, you know, you might just say, look, you know what, you picked the lock, let's move on. And that's a narrative thing, that's a keeping the game moving thing, but also I don't think it's totally unrealistic. I also think situations like that will probably be more the exception than the norm when dealing with things like thieves' skills. So, to wrap it up, when I hear people talk about the linear flat kind of a roll for something like percentile dice or d20, as opposed to a curved roll, rolling like in fudge dice, or rolling, and like I say, in games like GURPS where you're rolling in d6 and adding them, and things like that, and the probabilities and the idea of succeed, you know, what your average roll would be and the chance of success would be on average, as opposed to, you know, just totally flat random across the board. My response is, I think a lot of things to address the likelihood of not failing in combat or in crisis situations are addressed by the idea of increasing skills and increasing survivability in fights. And I also think that if you're getting into a situation where these kinds of flat rolls, like an ability check where you know you're rolling a d20 and trying to roll under your score, so a high score has a higher chance of success. If you're running into a situation where that's happening a lot and you're finding these results you think aren't realistic, I think the more likely explanation, and from an old school perspective, is you're rolling too much. And there are some things where, you know, like I say, unless there's a real good reason to worry about whether it succeeds or fails, and it really matters, then the dice might not be the best way to resolve that situation. Food for thought. That's all for now. See you next time.